Well, here we are at Theophantastique, and I don't have a regular podcast for this particular blog, but I do have occasional conversations. And today I'm privileged to have David Puglia. Did I pronounce that correctly, David?
You did.
I
Very good,
got
John.
it.
Thank you. Thanks for
Okay.
having me.
And I'm going to go ahead and read a brief bio that I found online. If you want to supplement that, please feel free to do so. David is associate professor and deputy chairperson in the English department at Bronx Community College of the City University of New York, where he teaches courses in folklore, children's literature, popular culture, and writing. He's the author or editor of 4 books, including one we're going to be talking about and focusing on today, North American Monsters, a Contemporary Legend Casebook. David, welcome to the conversation. There it is right there, folks, for those of
There's
you
right
who
there.
want to see the cover. Welcome to the conversation.
Oh, thanks so much for having me, John. It's great to be
Yeah.
here.
Is there anything you want to add to that bio that you want folks to
No,
know
that's pretty accurate. I wrote that myself, so that's
about? Okay.
pretty dead on. Um, yeah, no, I'm a folklorist. I come, and I think they'll come up in this conversation. I come very much to everything I do from the folklore lens, so I think that's the important thing to take away. I'm very interested in monster studies, but my little piece of it is kind of looking at how the folklore discipline can be involved, and then maybe what we can do to offer something to the much larger umbrella of monster studies.
Okay, fantastic. Well, I mentioned this before we started recording the conversation, but just for viewers, Bill Ellis, who's a friend and colleague and another folklorist, reached out to me privately, and he said you need to get David's new book on your radar. And also another previously I had a conversation with an anthropologist out of Australia on monster studies. And because Bill knows of my work as one of the co-editors of the Journal of Gods and Monsters, an online peer-reviewed journal, and he said, I think these perspectives are important and often missed. And so I'm glad he made me aware of your work, and that's how we were able to connect today. I always like to start on a personal note and find out how people came to develop a personal and academic interest in the study of monsters.
Yeah, thanks for asking that, John. I think my journey might be a little different than some. I know just some of the people I've worked with, monsters have really been a passion from early in their life, and for me, it came kind of the other direction. That the passion for me was the folklore and legend study, and I came to monsters after that because I noticed that there were these supposed monsters or cryptids out there that followed all of the rules that we discuss about legend, about how a legend works, what we call contemporary legend. Um, but there didn't seem to be too much investigation into that little subgenre of an already small field of legend studies. So it got me interested in seeing what could be done with that. And I'm from Maryland, and so we have a legendary monster or cryptid called the Goat Man. And so for one of my first real forays into formal folklore research, I wanted to study the goat man. And so the goat man, for those who don't know, which would be most people, is this half man, half goat who supposedly came out of the Beltsville Agricultural Research Center, possibly due to these strange illicit experiments that were going on in there. And now he haunts the back roads of Prince George's County in Maryland, attacking teenagers, throwing stones, that sort of thing. The classic back roads scary monster legend. And so I wanted to look into that. There wasn't a whole lot out there about it. Although when I checked the Maryland Folklore Archives, it turned out a dozen students before me had also done research into this topic and put their research into the folklore archives. So it was great to have. It's also completely inaccessible for anyone who isn't deeply interested in this subject. So I got interested in not just the goat man, but how many other monsters are there out there like that, where it's deeply important in a tiny little community, has quite a life of its own, but its circulation is very small. I wanted to know more about those kind of monsters. I wanted to know if there were other researchers out there who had encountered that in other parts of North America. And that's where I really got rolling on what else is out there. And then when I saw that there wasn't too much, or what there was good, but it was scattered, how could we kind of pull that together and have a like a starting point for others who wanted to pursue legendary monsters, in their own community.
Well, I don't want to assume any knowledge on the part of viewers here. Can
Mhm.
you just kind of give us an overview of the discipline, the academic discipline of folklore and legend studies, and how that is
Right.
applied to these kinds of things?
So I think of folklore as the larger of the two, and then legend studies as the subgenre of that. Although that can be debatable. So folklorists are people who are interested in repeated cultural practices, or the key word is often traditions of a group. And so that group could be regional, that group could be ethnic, that group could be religious. For my monster studies, that I'm particularly interested in, this legendary monster studies is often a regional group, and they're interested in specifically the tradition or the repeated narrative and belief that are associated with a monster in this monster legend studies sub genre. Uh, what I think it distinguishes it for specifically here is that folklorists are not monster hunters. Those would be the cryptozoologists. Folklorists are monster story hunters. They're hunting out the narrative, and that would hold true for subjects other than monsters as well. But they're hunting out the communities and the sustained narratives that exist in these communities. So whether or not a monster is real, or true, or really out there, it's just not so much of an interest to a folklorist, and that sometimes is annoying for people. But there it is. But whether or not this story is actually out there, whether the story is authentic, where we can find a community where this is a lived practice among people, that there's a circulating oral narrative, that there is something out, supposedly, presumably out there, that is not proven to be there, but there is some sort of sustained tradition that it is out there. That's when we're in the realm that a folklorist is going to be interested in, some sort of repeated tradition or cultural practice.
Okay, so whereas cryptozoologist or someone is trying to prove or disprove this kind of a thing, the folklorist isn't so much interested in is it real or not, but what's the narrative, the story behind it.
I think that's a very good way to summarize it. And of course, I should also point out what also separates us is, I think, a majority of the very good monster studies are of literature, popular culture. We're interested, perhaps, if our realm goes into that realm, but that's we see ourselves as having this other little niche that we live in
Yeah, well,
and
it
work
does bring up the interesting question. One of the things I co-edited a volume on the paranormal and pop culture. And
in.
personally, as a researcher, I'm not so much interested in, there tend to be the two camps, as you know, the true believer, I call them, or the skeptic, the debunker.
Mhm.
And I'm more interested in what does belief and acceptance of the paranormal tell us about our interest in transcendence and religion and these kinds of a thing. Is there a similarity in the discipline of folklore?
I think there very much is. It sounds very similar to how folklorists approach, um, this idea of not searching out whether it's true or not true, or even whether someone believes or doesn't believe, but finding what the how would we put it? Finding what the connection there is, regardless of what that ultimately means.
Yeah, now you have a great volume that I've been able to, I've got it in order, but I haven't got it yet. And but there was a great preview of the table of contents and your very helpful introduction for North American Monsters, a Contemporary Legend Casebook. How did that come together?
So it came together from a little bit of my frustration when I was trying to put together. I wanted to do my own Goatman work, and so we stand on the shoulders of giants, and I just couldn't find the starting materials of where I could, build. Where do I start from with this? What is the other material out there? And it was even more frustrating, not because it wasn't out there. There's been great work done, but the work was so scattered among journals that were out of print. They're not digitized. And what I wanted to do is bring it together for myself. And so, okay, if I can get this stuff, I can work with librarians and archivists, and I can have a body of work to get my own research rolling here. And I realized that pulling that together, I can't be the only one out here who's interested in monsters. And since working in this field, I now realize many of us are interested in monsters, that this needed to be pulled together as a service to the field so that every time somebody becomes interested in a local or regional legendary monster or cryptid, that they don't have to search all over the world to try to find what's out there, but that we could have it all in one body. So I was able to work with 19 great contributors. So some of them historical, I think about 2/3 of them historical, and the casebook goes in chronological order, and 1/3 of them were contributors specifically for this volume to kind of bring this scattered material together and then show a trajectory from the 70s to present of how our little discipline of legendary monster studies has unfolded, and hopefully where it can go in the future.
Now, you mentioned some of the materials from the 70s and some from the 80s and so on. Um, as you went through the selection process, why did you feel that some of these were, even though they were written a while ago, they're still relevant to our research and concerns for today?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I wanted to look specifically or I wanted to include chapters that spoke to concerns that I knew folklorists were continuing to encounter to this day. So I wanted them to be model studies. I also wanted them to be deeply involved in field work or ethnography, where the researcher is on the ground, is doing interviews, is using the methodologies that folklorists are attached to and attracted to. But then I also wanted to show a diversity of approaches, because there's not just one good way to study a legendary monster. So in the volume, there's for example, there are studies that are done entirely through verbatim interview transcriptions and working their way so this is to use an actual example here. The Boondock Monster, he changed, which is an Indiana camp monster, changes over the decades, and as that monster changes, it changes to reflect the particular decade's concerns in North America. Then there's the Cropsey monster, which is a slightly later early study, where similar ideas done verbatim interviews of people. And Cropsey is a New York State monster who also kind of haunts camps, well known among New Yorkers. And what that researcher was trying to do was trying to find where the hearth of this tradition is, and ultimately determined that was in the Catskills area and that it spread out from there. So these are perhaps not exactly what we're finding in the newer chapters, but they spoke to concerns of folklorists, and they show good models of how folklore, legendary studies of monsters can proceed.
Can you share another example or two so folks can kind of get an idea of? I'll include always in the description, include a link to the book, and hopefully folks
Yeah.
will seek it out. But just so we can kind of give them an idea of what's in store.
So in my chapter, so I have a chapter within my own book of the Goat Man. So that's more of looking at legend through journalism. And so folklorists, I'm not the first to have noticed this, that legend often spreads. We like to think it spreads person to person, like oral tradition spreads person to person, but legend often rides on the back of journalism and newspapers, and that's how it spreads further and wider in the region than it ever could simply mouth to mouth. And so Goatman, I determined, for example, really made his way through the state to become Maryland's state monster, not because of the oral tradition, which was certainly there, but because of journalists' interest in the oral tradition, which ultimately gets it to get the circulation that it could not otherwise have. Another one that I really like, that I think is one of the examples I would bring up if a monster studies person asks like why should folklorists even be included, I think a really great example is Angus Gillespie's essay on the Jersey Devil. So a very well known monster, right, and one that we can't say like only folklorists are aware of. Many monster study scholars are aware of the Jersey Devil. But a folklorist is able to approach it a little bit differently. In his article, he argues that the Jersey Devil and the Leeds Devil are in fact two completely separate entities. The usual argument is that the Jersey Devil came from the Leeds Devil. He argues that the Jersey Devil is in fact separate from the Leeds Devil. The Jersey Devil became prominent because New Jersey wanted a piece of regional identity or a regional mascot, perhaps, which literally became their hockey mascot. And through that's how the Jersey Devil was born. So I really liked his approach there. And then I think another one I would bring up, because I don't think anyone of the viewers are going to heard of this unless they're from that town, is the Weber monster in Newfoundland. And I bring that up just because I think that's another contribution that folklorists can make to monster studies, is these small, tiny little monsters, of which there are thousands, that'll just be overlooked if we're looking at the big monsters, the Bigfoots and the Sasquatches and the Jersey Devils. But there are these little ones that someone who's really interested in oral tradition and local community can root out, but otherwise would be overlooked. And I think that's a contribution that folklorists can offer to the larger field.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned the Jersey Devil. Yesterday, I'm a huge X-Files fan, and yesterday they just happened to be
Yeah.
playing the episode on the Jersey Devil.
Yeah.
And of
Season
course,
1, right?
yeah, Mulder's running off trying to chase it down, and Scully's trying to bring him back to her scientifically. So she brings in an anthropologist, but they discovered that maybe anthropology doesn't exclude but can create room for this. So it's always fascinating.
I've heard
How
that.
far we're talking about making connections between folklore and monster studies. How far back does folklore go as an academic discipline in terms of connecting with that?
Yeah, that's something that I've been wondering about as well. So in in my in the case book, what I say is we could say it goes earlier than even the formal organization of folklore itself, because people who ultimately go on to form the formal discipline of folklore, they were looking at monsters in folktale, and they were also looking at monsters as motifs and the motifs that form monsters, so like the building blocks of a narrative that form monster legends from very early into the inquiry into folklore. But as far as when does monster, and then I should even preface that I'm also kind of leaving out the paranormal, ghosts, the supernatural, and just doing creatures that supposedly but are not proven to exist. Certainly the ghosts and the paranormal have an older history. But as far as what I was able to find where there was sustained interest in this very specific creatures that may exist out there, the mid 20th century is when we start to see essays regularly published. But earlier than that, there are lots of smaller a part of a research study addresses a community's belief in the supernatural, the paranormal, or a monster specifically.
Yeah, one of the interesting parts of the introduction that you wrote there, it's a very lengthy introduction, and I was pleased to see that because it provides a wealth of helpful information before you ever get to the actual case studies. There's a discussion that you have about real or imagined in relation to monsters. Can you discuss this in connection with the tendency in monster studies in the West to approach them by way of they're just metaphor in relation to pop culture, and folklore is coming at it from a different perspective?
Yeah, so I discussed this at length in the chapter, not even to be or not to argue against what others have said necessarily, but just to show that folklorists have a little bit different perspective here. Because I won't lie. If I'm going to teach my children, most likely that monsters don't exist. But from because I think that's that's healthier for their mind. But from a folklorist's perspective, and both from a historical perspective of what has been referred to as monsters, when we look at just what folklorists have inquired into, it's just not necessarily great for those monsters that folklorists are interested in. There's a few different ways that that this comes up, but partially some of the legendary monsters are simply creatures that we know exist. We're just not sure if they exist in that particular place. So one that's close to my heart because it's where I am employed in New York City is the alligators in the sewers, which I think are a great legendary monster. It's not that they don't exist, it's just whether or not their habitat, whether or not they're really albino sewers that are albino alligators that can exist in under the streets of New York City. And we do have a chapter in there where Lauren Coleman pulled up that there was at least one alligator found in the sewers of New York City in the early 20th century. So we know it's happened. We know they could be there. So there's that legendary monsters can be creatures that are just out of place. And then there's also this conversation that's going on beyond folklore's little piece of monster studies and monster studies in general about monsterizing, but I think it's very important to for folklorists because monsterizing can happen so easily when you're working mostly with oral tradition and belief. So to use an example that comes from the book, the donkey lady in San Antonio is simply a woman who referred to as a spinster, but she's monsterized because she does not fit into the community's norms or values, and because of that, she ultimately becomes the donkey lady. She's monsterized. So it's often not really, it doesn't work for what folklorists are most interested to really worry about real or imaginary, because there are instances simply when we know that these monsters do exist. And then the other perspective is that it's also important that for folklorists, we always come at it from the community's perspective. So if it's in the lived experience of the community, if it exists for them from our research perspective, we start with that. There's much less of the skeptical inquiry among folklorists than there are in some of the other approaches to monster studies.
In some of my recent reading, and it might have been your introduction, but there was a gap between the time when I first downloaded it and read it and got in touch and we were able to schedule this. I came across a bibliographical reference, a book that kind of goes into local mapping out across the United States, local creatures and this type of thing. And I thought it would be great not only to study, but if I'm ever able to travel again post-COVID, but if I'm in an area, I'm going to look up and find out what local monsters there are and see if I can track down some memorabilia and things like that. What does folklore, what light is it able to shine on the local understanding? Why do certain local regions have a particular creature? What function is it serving in that community?
Yeah, that is, I think, the question to ask. Like, what function does this creature serve this community? And from looking at these 19 essays and the ones that weren't included, it varies from place to place, and it varies then also chronologically, or varies from era to era, what the meaning of the local monster is. And it's also interesting, these local monsters that are not as migratory, that they don't travel quite as much as something like the chupacabra or Bigfoot, the ones that are in a particular area. They can even have slightly different meanings within a region from one town to the next. So what we've found that, at least among the folklorists here who have to draw their conclusions at the end, they can be commenting on the environment. They can be commenting on crime. They can be commenting on the rapid the rapid industrialization or suburbanization of an area. So they definitely can comment, but that comment is free to change and definitely is localized to each individual monster. So that's really the goal of the folklorist, is to answer that question each time he or she
Okay.
pursues a legendary monster.
When I had Yasmin, the anthropologist, on, I
Hmm.
asked if there was an overlap at times between local tribes or peoples and their concern for the sacred and the existence of monsters. Is a folklorist, do they discover that? Are they concerned with the sacred or transcendent element at all?
I noted that when you asked Yasmin in your interview with her about the sacred, and so I went back and reread my introduction because in my head I I said I think of North American legendary monsters, especially in the 20th and 21st century, as a more secular phenomenon,
Hmm.
uh, and perhaps not perhaps there certainly are some where it's linked to, is this the devil walking the earth, including the goat man, and then certainly some of the older North American legendary monsters. I note I say twice in my introduction that it's that this phenomena in North America is more secular than sacred. I'm not wedded to that perspective, though. I'd
Right.
be happy for someone to show me otherwise. My sense is that it's more secular than sacred, but I'd be very interested to see more on that, and I'd be happy to change my mind on that.
Yeah, I wonder, I'll just throw this out on the table, whether you got an opinion or not is fine. With the shift in America and the West away from a comfort with institutional organized religion and towards a more
Hmm.
individualized spiritual questing orientation, if the paranormal in general can't, in some circumstances, reflect a desire for a connection to the transcendent and to mystery, even though it's not traditionally religious and connected to the sacred, maybe it's starting to become its own new form, again, for some people with a connection to the sacred. Any thoughts on that idea,
I
that
think I
theory?
just think I think I agree. I think you're onto it there. Um, the way you said it, the search for the transcendent and that something more is out there. It seems I that for some who want that, but they've rejected traditional ways of reaching the sacred. I've certainly have seen some rhetoric in the cryptozoological circles that I think, yeah, bears that out. I think what you're onto, from what I've seen, is accurate, and I would like to see more of that. But yes, that
Yeah,
I
that
think
would be
that's true.
interesting. I had a colleague on who did his PhD dissertation on the ghost hunting community, and he
Hmm.
noted
Hmm.
how even though many of them approach it from a secular perspective, they still grab onto the demonology from Christian theology and things like that. So it's just interesting to see, while it's secular in general in orientation, nevertheless, these things, we create these compartmentalized concepts, and
Right.
yet, things in reality are often messier and more porous than that. So it would be interesting to see that further line of research.
A way to approach the sacred for those who are uncomfortable with it. They can
Yeah,
call it
yeah,
secular
exactly.
while
Yeah,
having the
yeah.
sacred. That's I like that.
Any thoughts about what folklore can tell us about ourselves? Let me give you the way I connected with Bill Ellis years ago. I was working for this organization, and we were doing some reporting on the Lacey Peterson murder case. And what struck
Hmm.
me was how the defense had floated out the idea that some shadowy characters had been seen in the neighborhood, and maybe it was Satanists who had kidnapped her and dismembered her in a ritual. And Bill had some fascinating perspectives to share in terms of what folklore can tell us about such ideas. So, what does folklore, as it relates to the monster and what does it tell us about ourselves?
Yeah, that's good. And Bill has done great service warning about some of the excesses of the satanic panics, and that's so. Thank you, Bill Ellis. Yeah, for I think the monster, from the monster perspective, one from what I've seen, it's not as dangerous as some of the other legends can be when they get out of control. So some of the legends need to have somebody that can help put put the community back in perspective. I haven't seen that as much with monsters. And I think part of that is just how people approach legendary monsters. So the danger there is running into a charlatan who will hoax you out of your money to try to bring you on some sort of monster hunt or monster trip, but or will try to protect his or her property Scooby-Doo style by invoking some sort of monster. But the consequences that I've seen so far with legendary monsters just don't seem to be the same with as they are with some of the other legendary cycles. So it doesn't need this particular group of legends I've seen so far. They don't need an advocate the same way that Bill needed to be an advocate to defend some people because of the satanic panic. And I like that about North American monsters, that there's been this thesis since Dorson created it that perhaps in other parts of the world people truly fear monsters, legendary monsters, but in America that it's really more about ribbing people. It's a comical pursuit rather than a horrifying one. And I think because of that, it changes the perspective. It changes how people approach this particular subject matter. It's perhaps not as dire as it would be in other parts of the world or at other times.
Now, to bring this back to the concerns over an interdisciplinary approach, one of the things Yasmin mentioned, what her concern in her work is that monster studies has not listened to all the voices, the relevant voices from various academic disciplines, and she would like to see anthropology there. Are you of a similar kind of concern that there's a deficit in terms of the contribution of folklorists?
Yes, I think that I'm a fan of Yasmin and of her work. I think she's right. I think she's right with anthropologists, and I think folklorists can just follow her lead and make the same request. Now, it's really the impetus is on folklorists to have a body of scholarship that we can offer to monster studies. But I think the benefits can go both directions. Folklorists can offer monster studies, monsters that they would otherwise not have heard of, the lived experience of monsters in our own backyard. I think that's what differentiates folklorists from anthropologists. So if an anthropologist can offer monsters beyond the West, folklorists can offer the hyper local, the monsters that we grow up with. And then monster studies, I think, can also really enliven what folklorists do, because folklorists sometimes are criticized. They'll go out there, they'll collect, they'll do rigorous field work, but they'll stop there. They'll put it in the archive, or they'll type up the results and they'll be done. But there's, I think, a level of rigorous analysis that happens in monster studies that we don't always necessarily do in folklore studies, and at least not in legendary monster studies. And I think the two could work together to improve our little tiny little piece and the huge monster studies. There could be something good there.
Yeah, well, it makes monster studies even bigger. And doesn't it also provide another venue for us to move beyond just considerations of pop culture on the one hand, and also you mentioned you thought it had a more secular orientation, whereas religious studies has had a strong influence in monster studies. It adds another dimension. Would you agree with that
That's true.
assessment?
I would agree with that. And also, I think monster studies just get me in the thought. One of the problems for legendary monster studies, for folklorists working with monsters, is it's not a respectable pursuit. Whereas I think monster studies can be a very respectable pursuit. Often you're doing analysis of important literature. Everybody agrees that it's important to analyze Dracula or Grendel or Frankenstein's monster. So perhaps folklore could hitch to that wagon, hitch to that star, and have some of that respectability that I think monster studies has, that I would like to see legendary monster studies have as well.
Okay, well, I told Yasmin that I was going to make the pitch to my co-editors that we might try and have a multidisciplinary issue or two of the journal and have anthropologists I'm assuming you've got folks in your network that you would be interested from the folklore perspective in such
I
a
hope so. Yeah.
conversation.
Yeah.
Yeah, awesome. Okay, well, I will make that pitch. I gave Yasmin an opportunity is there anything I missed about what would you like viewers to know about your book or about this particular topic that I might have missed in the questions that I've asked?
I think you asked really good questions, John. Thank you. I think I would just like people to know that they're I know people are interested in legendary monsters, and I realize that as a scholar, it's not always the safest thing to pursue. But I'd like to see more legendary monster studies, especially at that local level. There's people out there doing it. We could support each other, and I'd like to see this work continue in this one little tiny sub genre of monster studies. So let's support each other, and let's keep it going.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, I want folks to look in the program description with this video for a link to David's work and to pick up a copy of his book, North American Monsters, a Contemporary Legend Casebook, and published right here in my home state of Utah. So
That's right. That's right.
yeah. Well, David, thank you so much for coming on and having this conversation.
Thanks, John. I really appreciate you setting this up.
Yeah, it was great. Again, folks, seek this out. And until the next conversation we have here at Theo Fantastique.